After years of searching for some news of Naya, be it a lead to know what had truly come of her, or in his wildest dreams to find her alive, fate had a peculiar way of unfolding, as the two were indeed to meet again in the depths of the zero level on board of the Dark Sentencer. After the two reunited, with some reservations on her side, they decided they must leave. Through a complex channel of tunnels, pipes, and shafts, they met with Mr. Wish and his band of windows. Nostrand knew they would be in safe company with them, allowing them a moment's rest in an otherwise chaotic world. Naya and Nostrand lay together much like they had many years ago, Naya finally allowing herself to sleep, as she found herself dreaming. Much like Nostrand, she had visions of a child, of a son named Vaxus. Elsewhere on this wretched planet, the wheel spun into motion as Sam knew he had to try to save as many as he could from the soon inevitable collapse of this world. With his incredible ability to hack, he seized control of the oppressive computer systems that had governed them all. He inspired the poor workers to run their machines against their captors to escape with a speech so stirring he shocked everyone in the mines, and himself. With the passage now exposed, they had fled into darkness. Edson Aressa had just celebrated his 5th year as an export chaperone on the Dark Sentencer, his 2nd decade as a pilot. He always looked forward to the synchronous shift change. It kept the airspace in the pavilion that much clearer for departure. There was nothing better than open, star-filled air on a planet that felt endlessly congested. Edson tended to get to the hangar early these days, not on purpose, but almost as if his body sensed the freedom ahead and urged him towards it. He whistled to himself as he walked through the quiet corridor of the hangar towards the green room to get suited up for the day's flight. Edson pressed his face to the recognition scanner, the red light beaming into his pupils and across the terrain of his big nose. Access granted. That was the last thing he heard as he fell unconscious into Nostrand's sturdy, waiting grasp. "Sorry, Edson?" Nostrand whispered, trying to read the ID badge on the man's shirt. Naya looked both ways down the hall and pushed open the doors to the green room. There was no activity inside, so Nostrand walked backwards inside, dragging all 188 pounds of Edson along with him. Dozens of glass lockers lined the room, flight uniforms inside. Nostrand searched for a good place to let Edson sleep it off. A restroom in the far corner seemed like a decent option. He laid the heavy body down on the black, glimmering tile, examining his name tag for an identifier of the ship that they'd need to look for. Tag number GVD8001. He snatched Edson's ID, locked the door from the inside, and carefully pulled it shut. In the green room, Naya had smashed the front of a locker on the lowest level with the butt of her blaster. She pulled out her HOSS flight uniform, examined the tag inside, reading it aloud. Janine Small. Naya held the suit up to her body, checking it for the size. The pant leg hung down, just below, a few inches, but otherwise seemed like it'd fit. More like Janine Tall, but whatever. We'll make it work. She said and unzipped the arm of a jumpsuit in one fluid motion. She pulled her arms out by the sleeve, folding it down and off her legs. Nostrand noticed a cluster of letters and numbers scratched into her arm. SA#9432DL plus W #81. It looked to have been recently scabbed over. She saw him watching her, and Nostrand turned his head away, embarrassed at her near nudity. Oh, come on, Captain Modesty. I believe that you've seen my bits before. Nostrand swiped the ID through Edson's locker. I get it, it's just... It's gonna take some time. Well, don't think I'm not about to check yours out, buddy. Come on, strip down so that I can objectify you, she said, cracking a smile as she stepped into Janine's HOSS flight uniform. Nostrand removed the uniform from the locker. He turned away from her, looking back over his shoulder precariously as he pulled his shirt up and over his head. No peeking. The night together had pushed over a domino of healing. They had been confused and conflicted without the resolution of knowing what happened that day at Potts International. Now, with the truth projected into the universe, each of their perspectives aired, the burden had been lifted. Like a gush of oxygen rushing toward a flame, they were both falling quickly back into the shells of the pair that they had left behind. Fortunately for them, there wasn't time to overthink any of it. Naya and Nostrand had a ship to steal. Nostrand dressed himself in Edson's HOSS gear. It was tight on his bulky frame, but not restricting. She gave him an approving nod, popped Janine's helmet on, and exited the door of the green room. Nostrand followed suit, tucking the lengths of his hair down into his collar. The pair walked in long strides, one in front of the other, through the hangar so not to draw attention to themselves. Naya looked absently at the walls as she moved. Nostrand stared at the back of her head. Pilots had started arriving and suiting up for the day, greeting each other with slight head nods. It wasn't uncommon to see new faces in the hangar. Longevity was encouraged, but rare on the Dark Sentencer. One could imagine it was a depressing work environment, flying all around the planet on hospice. As a result, HOSS was always hiring and firing. Naya led the way out of the hangar, suspicious of every passing being. Across the planet, the aerodrome was alive, small transport ships coming in and out like gnats, miniaturized by the all-encompassing scope of the pavilion. Some carried supplies, food, clothing, weapons, and others were there to pick up guards who the warden had already begun to station on the other prison planets. Nostrand trailed behind Naya, calculating the next strategy with each step. Caution. Scheduled transport arriving in T-5 minutes. The automated message bellowed across the pavilion, stopping conversation in its tracks as pilots and shipping techs sped up to their positions. The cargo ship levitated up through the levels, floating effortlessly with tons upon tons of invaluable freight inside. The back of the ship was flat and wide, two enormous iron panels built to pivot easy for unloading. It wasn't made to leave the atmosphere of the planet, simply for picking up and holding points and ultimately delivery here to the ship that it would now haul off-world. Naya watched the ship rise. She thought of all the lives that would be lost for the sake of these daily shipments. There were millions scattered across the planets who could go on without, while others had so much. Her blood pressure began to rise, and she walked faster through the aerospace, darting between motorized ground transports. Everywhere she looked, the HOSS logo screamed off of shoulders and metallic siding of vehicles. Nostrand picked up his pace to keep her in sight. He recalibrated his plan to account for the potential moves of others around them, considering who he'd have to take out first in the event of a problem. GVD-8001. He saw it in the distance, already on the ground and waiting. Matte obsidian with curves of a country road would envy. The end in sight. All flight personnel to export gate. Cargo transfer in progress. The cargo ship lowered onto the airfield, landing with a as the iron panels opened like a newly minted star, warm yellow light pouring from within. The crew got to work immediately, climbing up the large platforms to secure chains to the containers of core energy for transfer. Naya and Nostrand slipped by as a crane began to pull the containers up. Nostrand motioned to Naya, indicating which ship was the one that they were looking for. He pushed the button on the release bay, the top of the ship slowly pulling open. He hopped over the side, planting himself in the pilot's chair. Naya used the open bay as a step to climb into the second commander's seat. They both breathed in deeply, watching as the last of the containers were hoisted into the waiting export ship. This was the beginning, or possibly the end. Nostrand pulled his helmet off and keyed in the sequence, hesitating slightly. The dash illuminated, and Naya removed her helmet and placed it on her lap. "Think that you remember how to fly this thing?" she asked. "Well, I did drop out just before we learned to take off, so..." Naya looked at him, stunned. "I'm kidding. I can at least get us off the ground." "That'll have to do, Nos, but even if we do get shot down, sounds like a pretty fantastic to die anywhere but here." She turned to look at him, but his face was already there, watching her speak like a red traffic light, or an alarm clock, or anything else reliably waiting for the tide to turn. Their lives had cycled over and again without one another, yet here they are, colliding once more at the start and the end of a new phase. There was an entire future in the moment, an invisible current forming down the center of the stolen ship, their toes dangling dangerously over the edge. Nostrum touched Naya's cheek, his brain begging her to wordlessly know what there was no coming back from this. The universe couldn't handle another almost. She tugged into him, his mouth drawn to his. No time to waste, yet there was no other choice. There was only him. And this was home. But their lips never met. Instead, an explosion, as the blast of a bionic grenade thrower ripped through the side of the transport, shattering the impenetrable glass of the bay. The detonation sent Naya out of the ship, knocking her unconscious. Nostrum's head slammed against the pilot's seat, nose bleeding from the impact. He anxiously called for Naya, a fire spreading quickly throughout the ship's hold. The flame was on a warpath for the fuel tank, and without warning, Nostrum was pulled out of the chair and tossed onto the floor of the airfield like a wet blanket. Otto towered over him and chuckled deeply.
Didn't I tell you that bitch would bring you nothing but trouble?
He held up the bionic thrower, still smoking in his hand. Nostrum tried to catch his breath, trying to catch a glimpse of where Naya was.
Well, I wish I could say I've been looking for you all this time, but fuck me, you're predictable. I can barely even remember the man that you used to be when we ran things American. You knew the taste of real loyalty. Sometimes it burns and it makes you gag, but you choke it down anyway.
A choir of alarms sounded throughout the pavilion. Emergency warnings, red alert. Fleets of guards ran in all directions, many suited up in full HOSS SWAT gear. Otto and Nostrum stared each other down suspiciously, unsure what was happening around them. It didn't matter. Their business was right here. Otto tossed the grenade launcher onto the unforgiving ground. He pulled out an SA-41 blaster.
Now, this is what true love looks like. Actually, this beauty and I have a bit of a history together. Not this exact one, I suppose, but maybe a sister or a cousin. See, this is the blaster I shot your old lady with.
Otto made the sound effect with his mouth, flicking his head and mimicking the wound he inflicted to Naya's head.
Boom! Well, I didn't quite get the job done, I guess, but sometimes you've got to give a broad a second chance. Am I right? She won't let me down this time. Not the way yours is, lying over there like a fucking corpse whilst I finish her, man. Maybe it's payback for the way that you left her there to die. Of your aunt crying out of that bank where the blood gurgled out onto the floor.
Nostrum pulled himself from the ground, squatting on one knee as he slowly stood up. The blood thickened between his nose and across his lips. You talk a big game, all loaded up with weapons that I have to assume that the warden gave you. It seems unlike you, Otto. Bowing down to authority, Otto stood motionless.
I don't need none of these to take your ass down. They're only the icing,
he said, and he dropped the blaster for dramatic effect. Otto rushed towards Nostrum, tackling him and smashing his head on the ground with a firm thud. Nostrum kicked backwards, pushing Otto's weight off him, but Colossus was relentless. He hadn't earned that nickname by being an easy match. Otto was back on his opponent within seconds. Nostrum landed a punch right at the side of the temple, in the soft, delicate space that sends a man down in a single blow, but Otto hardly flinched. It only made him angrier. The missing side of his mouth began to lather up with foamy saliva as he used his enormous body to crush Nostrum back down. Otto's voice chiseled its way into Naya's awareness and across the airfield. She started to stir. Her eye slowly opened as the heat of the fire consumed Edison's ship. Soldiers running amok, panic. The nightmare deepened as she eased away to sitting. She saw Otto on top of Nostrum, his tree-trunk knees pressing all of his weight down onto him as he exacted blows between Nostrum's eyes. She remembered that day at Potts. Otto was supposed to be watching the door, his blaster stiff at his side. She could practically feel the weighty stacks of paper money as she visualized pulling them from the safe, the heat of his massive hand on hers as she tied up the full bag, an unexplained evil in his features as he pulled the sack out from under her grasp and thrown it into the corner of the safe.
If you want it all, my dear, go and get in. Actually, I'm gonna be taking it all.
And before Naya could react, the blast struck her. The lights in the ceiling was the last thing that she saw before everything went dim. On the airfield, Otto's assault on Nostrum continued. The sound of knuckle on bone was too much for her to handle. Naya aimed the blaster that she'd taken from the failed assassin on 0 level. She turned the safety off, engaging the power switch. The light flickered a sharp, defeated red. It had been discharged overnight and needed charging. Her heart fell 10 stories. Nostrum shook his body back and forth like a snake trying to work himself from Otto's mass. His face was swelling fast, his lungs were confused under the weight. At this rate, he didn't have long. Please, just run, Naya, he thought. Don't wait for me. He needed her to go. If he had any breaths, he'd have screamed for her to. But the world was getting dark. The swirls of reflective light sparkled, twirling through his vision. Otto's form doubled, tripled before him. The alarms hadn't stopped. Relentless squealing and screeching in Nostrum's fading ears. Why hadn't they stopped? Why hadn't an army come for them yet? His vision was still multiplied as Otto pulled a mace from the sleeve on his back. Nostrum fixated on the black filth that had collected around the base of Otto's exposed teeth. Anything unprotected was bound to get dirty. Otto shook his head slightly, a parting disapproval for an old pal.
Your weakness landed me here, but killing you's gonna make this shithole feel like a fucking utopia.
Otto unceremoniously raised the mace above his head. Nostrum didn't want to blink. He couldn't imagine retreating to a comfortable oblivion behind his eyelids in his final moment, so instead he looked up, past Otto, past the levels of the Dark Sentencer, and into a future in the stars he may never know. Kiss your mother with that filthy mouth, Naya screamed over the sound of anarchy. You fucking monster! Come on, Otto! You know Paradise would never let you in. Brr, brr, brr. The alarms continued their frenetic wail. Neither of the men could see as Naya pulled the stolen ordnance device from out of a bag. Soaking wet, hot, liquid iron coating Nostrum's skin, clogging his nostrils. Fresh blood gushed across his face, but it didn't belong to him. It was Otto's, and it wasn't just blood, no. Otto's intestines were also splayed out across Nostrum's own abdomen. The gutter around his waist was not visible any longer, instead buried deep in his stomach, leaving a distinguishing cavern as the intensity of the corkscrew would send his insides in every direction. Otto still had a look of shock etched into his face as he fell to the side, mace in hand, freeing Nostrum. Behind him stood Naya. She was holding the device in her hand. I stole it from the warden. I took a shot on the override password. She pulled up her sleeve, showing him the passcode that she'd scratched into her arm. I mean, is this an asterisk, or... She was panting, and Nostrum saw 2 small tears roll down her cheek. What else can you do but take a shot sometimes? Nostrum wiped the blood from his face, running towards her. He lifted her off the ground, pulled her up, and tightly wrapped her arms around her neck. They held on to each other. As inmates started to filter into the pavilion, as HOSS guards started to fire shots, as gutters started to shred abdomens, as prisoners started to fight back, as the subservers started to riot through the levels towards salvation above, as military transports started dropping teams from the sky, as the warden boarded a ship on the loading dock of the watchtower, as the red alarms cried and cast strobes across the airfield. They held each other against it all for a minute more, as if all life depended on it. Maybe it did. And when they finally pulled apart, Nostrum and Naya surveyed the anarchy with hungry, happy eyes. 3 shared between them. Nostrum couldn't help but smile as he thought about Sam down in the 0 level. He wished he could have seen him hack into the mainframe security to let the workers free. likely on the verge of a panic attack the whole time. Nostrand hoped that Sam wouldn't see his mum for a very long time, that he could live a full life and do thousands more things to make himself and her proud. Nostrand hoped his own parents were proud of him, too, even just a little bit. Naya reached into her bag, pulling out their masks. She handed the yellow one to Nostrand. His face fell into shock. If we make it out of here, maybe you'll tell me about how, I got these back? Are you ready? As ready as the day that we met. You're adorable. And so, as the pair covered their faces with the masks from their previous lives, laughing in the face of the impossible odds looming against them, they were up for the challenge. So, that is Vaxus, Act 1, The Unheavenly Creatures. Thank you for listening. Coheed and Cambria, created by Claudio Sanchez, written by Chondra Echert, art by Chase Stone, story and art concept by Claudio Sanchez, art coordination and design by Virgilio Tzaj.